I'm pigged on Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your co-host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we're going to be getting into the Mavericks halfway through the season marker, halfway in the season review, whatever you want to call it. We're going to be analyzing what this Dallas Mavericks team has done 41 games. I guess technically 42 since we're recording this after the Clippers game last night. We're going to be analyzing what the Mavericks have done up until this point into the season. We're getting into a variety of different topics, of course, such as does this Mavericks team have an identity at the moment? And if so, what is it? We're going to analyze the third ball handler situation, how the Mavericks have tended to that situation and the lack of a third ball handler, and what they've done to supplement so far this season, because that was obviously a big question coming into the season when we were in the offseason. We're going to talk about Luka standing in the MVP conversation, as that is something that's kind of getting under talked about right now amidst the most insane stretch of his career, quite literally. And, I think a lot of the advanced statistics would definitely be pointing in Doncic's favor in terms of, being the front runner in that discussion. So we'll, of course, get into that. We're going to, kind of compare this year's team versus last year's team. Things of that nature. We'll get into some trade stuff, not necessarily like specific fake trades that we can see the Mavericks doing, but just like which players are more expendable on this team. What type of player do you think the Mavericks are going to be looking for at the trade deadline? Do you think that they're actually going to make a move for one? We'll take a little step back, look at the Mavericks brass, the head coach situation. How are Nico Harrison, Mark Cuban, Jason Kidd doing? We're going to make some predictions at the end of the podcast, in terms of where we think the Mavericks might be at the end of the year with their record, where we predicted them to be probably halfway through the season, what we thought their record may have been right now. And, then lastly, we'll kind of look at every player just a little bit and, not do some sort of like deep, season in review or analyzation, but we'll give a brief debrief on everybody on the team real quick, just a sort of a state of the dress or State of the Union address or whatever you want to call it, right? Where we kind of we'll talk about everybody, who we've been surprised by, who kind of surpassed expectations, who maybe went under expectations, and who kind of met expectations, things of that nature. But, we talk about these guys on the daily, so we won't go insanely in depth to them, but we'll definitely kind of cover some of the overarching things in terms of their performance this season. But before we get into all that on this splendid halfway season in review pod, here is an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, Jaren, so getting into it right off the top, I think a kind of a question that has really not been posed by too many Mavericks fans, and when I did ask this on Twitter, I got kind of some mixed responses, but I do think that it is kind of intriguing in its nature if you really answer the question to its core, right? I posed the question, what is the identity of this Mavericks team right now? And, a lot of people responded, like, we have a heliocentric offense and Luka is our play style and he is our team. Like, that's like the play style of the Mavericks, but as a team, what is their identity? And I guess what I mean by that more so, what I insinuate by that question is, like, what direction do you think that this team is going in long term? What have they shown you up until this point of the season that like helps shape like a team-wide identity? And do you think that they have like a clear direction in terms of where they're going, whether they're going backwards, forwards, or they're just stagnating? What do you think the identity of the 2022-23 Dallas Mavericks has been up until this point?
I think just looking at it, from a general perspective, I mean, this definitely hasn't been the season that we all hoped for after that Western Conference Finals run that we made last season. I figured we would probably be finals contenders, at least contenders to the worst. But nonetheless, I mean, this team, after taking such a huge drop of basically losing our second player for nothing, I think they're definitely on the horizon. The future is bright is basically what I'm trying to say. Now, I mean, with that being said, if you're looking at play style or, how the fit looks on the court, whatever it may be, I don't mean to get as general as this, but it just kind of depends on, kind of circling one player is Tim Hardaway. I mean, if you keep him on the team, clearly you're committing to the, I guess, 3-point shots, the heliocentric model or whatever you want to call it. Whatever, I don't know. I just think, there's a lot of flexibility that you can have around that, whether it's with him or not. But I mean, a lot's going to say of what's going to happen in this offseason. I know we're halfway through, but I think to me, the future looks bright, especially with Hardy coming in, doing such a great job that he's been doing these past few games, with Josh Green's emergence. Christian Wood has looked amazing on court, with the Luka fit and everything, and how Luka's been playing. I think it's just safe to say, or it's hard not to say, that the future doesn't look bright.
Yeah, no, so that's an interesting point that you make there, regarding Tim Hardaway Jr. being kind of like essentially like the marker, that you've like basically you're identifying with the Mavericks play style and their identity to an extent. I mean, there's like a lot of like narratives, I guess, you can bring in with that, right? Like Tim Hardaway Jr. was, I believe he's the only piece remaining from the KP trade when that happened.
No, he is. Yeah.
He's definitely one of the more tenured veterans on the Mavericks. I think outside of Luka, and Dwight and Dorian, of course, and Maxey, like the absolute staples who have been here since, before Luka's rookie year. Like, I'm pretty sure Tim Hardaway Jr. is like one of the more longer tenured Mavericks. So that's interesting how, you align his performance and, just him kind of being this catch and shoot guy, in line with like the heliocentric play style that the Mavericks are committed to with Luka and things of that nature. It was a very interesting comparison. I think that there's credence to the fact that the Mavericks may have a bright future, and I mean, especially with the potential ascension of Jaden Hardy and Josh Green, and of course, who knows how they're going to pan out in the future, but I think that we're all definitely pleasantly surprised that they're probably giving us a little bit more than, at times we may have been admittedly maybe a little too pessimistic upon them, and the Mavericks, these guys aren't going to move the needle. But like, I mean, who knows what these guys could develop into in a few years. I mean, I definitely think there's credence to that, like you said. But I would push back on just in terms of like how like overtly set I am on the Mavericks being, in that upper echelon, for years to come and having like a really bright future. I think that there are some things that have to be addressed with this team.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
I don't know if they have the assets and the draft capital necessarily to pull it off. And I think that that's a lot of things that's a lot of the reason that fans have been so pessimistic around this team is just the lack of a clear direction. And that's kind of what I posed that question regarding the Mavericks identity, because in my opinion, they don't have an identity. And I don't know if that's controversial in nature, but just from like a team-wide perspective, it's like this team has kind of been the benefactors of a really insane Luka stretch, obviously the best of his career, throughout a stretch in which they beat, some teams with a really weak strength. They were beating some pretty bad teams. They had a really like weak strength of schedule. This Mavericks team has found some weird ways to lose this year. They found some, weird ways to win. But, like the consensus is, I think, is that, this team is like very much if you just watch them game to game, and if you never like kept track of the score or anything, what do you think this Mavericks team record would be?
I mean, I don't even think they reached the 500 point echelon, but
yeah, I would probably predict like 500 or somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So that's why I bring this up. They have some like weird occurrences and happenings, and by all means, definitely jovial that they are where they are right now in terms of their record and being fourth or fifth in the West. But there's obviously a lot of work to do, and there's a much harder strength of schedule going forward and things of that nature. And we'll have to see how they reincorporate Maxey, Dorian, and Josh when they get back from their injuries. That's another thing to mention, of course. These guys, all three of those guys essentially have been out like 2 or 3 weeks now, and Maxey While Dorian and Josh are on the horizon to return. Maxey, of course, probably going to be out like another month and a half. And all of this essentially has happened in this insane Luka stretch where, he led the Mavericks to that 7-game win streak, had multiple 50-plus point outings, a 60-point game, that game against the Knicks, of course. So it's definitely been like a really weird stretch for the Mavericks, but they've, done more than tread water, amazingly. But it still, feels as if like, okay, like we haven't got this team at full strength. We see in a game like the Clippers and the Celtics game, like these past couple teams, like they clearly, I can't speak for when their rotation is, fully there because we only saw that a few times at the beginning of the season, of course, but they clearly can't match up at least in this rendition of the team against the best teams in the league when those teams are, healthy, and honestly, probably, when the Mavericks are healthy as well, yet they're able to smack down pretty handily on some of these worser opponents. At least I think if, some of these role players like Maxey, Dorian, and Josh were playing in that stretch where Luka, was having his insane stretch against a weak strength of schedule, like I think the Mavericks they definitely probably take care of some of those games a little more handily. But it's like, are they just like teetering somewhere in like perpetual mediocrity? Do you think that this team is like a certain amount of moves away from like being like in real contention, or do you think that they're like purposefully stagnating en route to just kind of getting the season over with, so they have some different things open up in terms of their future draft picks that they can trade? Then I think after this season they'll be available to trade their 2025 pick, things of that nature. Are they kind of just playing the waiting game this year, as they're kind of limited in terms of their flexibility?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, like it's a little bit of everything in my opinion. I mean, I hate to be this way. This is like legacy media 101 right here, but I mean, you have Luka Doncic, so your future's automatically going to be bright in some way. Now, with that being said, I think if the Mavericks play their pawns right with this whole Christian Wood situation, of course, with Josh Green and Jane Hardy, their emergence, that's key. But nonetheless, I think if you can play your pawns right in that situation, it definitely bodes well for a future that is brighter with Luka Doncic. But alluding to this season, they found a way to more than tread water, or like tread water better than most teams have this season, especially with how wild the West has been. They found a way to sort of elevate into a 4th seed whenever, I don't believe they're a 4th seed. I know you don't believe they're a 4th seed. So I guess just that alone, and again, I mean, I know it's Luka Doncic and everything, but just that alone, I think with how mediocre this team is, you add a few more pieces here and there, minus this season, of course. You add a few pieces here and there, of course, you get some guys back from injury. This team, the future looks brighter. Now, with that being said, just this season alone, I think this is more of a, I don't want to call it a punt season because I do think that they're a playoff team, but a mediocre season like what we'll see of Luka Doncic era, I guess, in Dallas. But I think as long as the Mavericks can play their pawns right, which, history says they don't. Again, I mean, this is like, I don't want it to be this way, but Nico's Harrison, he has to really, I guess, get the ball rolling here, which I haven't seen enough of to prove not, or I guess to prove different what he can do with his job. But I mean, I just think that there's a few moves away from this team's being another contender, or at least another Western Conference approach, or Western Conference appearance than what they are now.
No, like 100%. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there when, talking about where this team currently projects. But, with that being said, obviously, we're not going to go in depth into this or anything, but, we have to obviously mention Jalen Brunson's departure. Of course, when he left over the offseason, that vastly, I think, had to affect, even if maybe national media didn't recognize it. I think those of us that, are covering the team day to day definitely recognize that this was going to be something that severely hampered the Mavericks if they didn't make the correct moves in accordance to fill the void that he left. And, they did indeed add Christian Wood, which we'll get into him and his contract situation a little later. But, that did fill a void of some of the offensive production, it's not some sort of like one-of-one replacement for Brunson that
For sure. Yeah.
the Mavericks brass is kind of try to push the agenda of at points. So that's obviously definitely, I think, something that I definitely would like to segue into, and that's of course the third ball handler situation and the progression of that, what the Mavericks have tried to do to supplement for the loss of Jalen Brunson, who again, we're not going to go into his departure. We have a plethora of off-season podcasts. If you want to go listen to us rant about the Mavericks objectively failing to keep Jalen Brunson around and their mismanagement of his contract that dates back to when, his rookie year, things of that nature, you can go listen to that. But, that's not something we're going to harp on at this point. But we obviously have to acknowledge his departure and the void that he left. So how do you think the Mavericks have been able to try and fill this third ball handler situation? They've obviously signed a couple guys, and now, those guys are no longer on the team. Do you think that they've been able to bounce back from his departure in that department relatively effectively? Or do you still think they're looking for a solution?
Okay. I mean, like, for sure, this team is looking for a solution nonetheless. But, you really have to go back to that whole situation between Goran Dragic and then the Dallas Mavericks in the offseason. Pretty much where the Mavericks neglected to sign Dragic to a contract because he would only be playing one of 5 games or one of every 5 games. Now, I think the Mavericks have completely swallowed the pill on that narrative where, hey, we don't need a third ball handler. We have Frank Ntilikina. He's the guy. They've completely swallowed their word on that, and I think they've owned up to it. But, with how they've, I guess, band-aided over that mishap that they had, Facu Campazzo, Kemba Walker, now Jaden Hardy. It's definitely a topic of discussion and a sore subject whenever it revolves the Mavericks, but I don't want to say they've done a terrible job. I don't want to say they've done a great job. They've done a mediocre job. I think that this is probably the best job they've done yet to date with the whole Jaden Hardy sort of situation, Jaden Hardy and Frank, whatever you want to call it. I just think that this is probably the best outlook for the team. You're developing a guy that is I think he's only 20 years old now. Worst comes to worst, he just doesn't turn out, but he's been playing pretty good. Now, is there a future plan for this? I hope there is, because that's sort of like 3-headed snake sort of situation where Dinwiddie was coming off the bench and then you had Brunson and Luka handling the ball, and that starting lineup that was just so deadly for other teams in the West. And I would hope to see other things like that, or at least a identity with that again. But it just kind of seems like the Mavericks are running their same sort of philosophy on offense with that same mind whenever they clearly don't have the personnel to do so.
Yeah, no, I think that you brought up some great points there. I think I would definitely reciprocate what you said about Hardy. Just from the standpoint that, with the Walker and the Campazzo situations, Walker, obviously, in a couple games there, you definitely really saw the potential in terms of him actually being able to be, Dinwiddie, of course, maintains his position. He would have maintained his position theoretically. You saw that division when Walker scored 32 against the Cavs in that one game when, a plethora of Mavericks weren't playing. And just a few other games where he definitely outperformed, I think, really any of our expectations, just really in, maybe 2 or 3 games, right? But he obviously just wasn't able to play consistently, in no small part due to his knee. And, it just wasn't when it became time for the Mavericks to make a decision in regards to his contract being guaranteed or non-guaranteed. They obviously chose to not guarantee it, and he was subsequently waived. And it was unfortunate because, I did like Kemba in his very, very, very brief time here. He was a great guy. He seemed like he, was actually making a conscious effort to, get to know the young players and the younger guards and stuff like that, and mentor them where he could. And he played and he gave his all when he was on the court as well. But, if his knee, I guess, really just was that bad as, those in the Mavericks front office kind of had alluded to and things of that nature. It makes sense as to why he's gone, because he couldn't even provide a steady 10 to 15 minutes a game, which, I think he had the skill to and was good enough to do so. but I just don't think his knee was able to hold up. And Campazzo is a whole other story, that I think was a sort of abject failure by the Mavericks front office after they saw in preseason that they couldn't go into the regular season without a third ball handler, and obviously we can go back to the offseason in terms of diagnosing that was going to be an issue for the Mavericks. I don't know if whose like prerogative that was to be like, oh, like we can do ball handling by committee. I don't know if the Mavericks were just trying to like test the water, see if they could get away with that play style without having another ball handler to come in and relieve duty, that duty sometimes. Like even like last year before they had Brunson in, before they had Dinwiddie, like they at least had Trey Burke to come in, sometimes at the beginning of the season, they legitimately had nothing until Campazzo was signed, I believe, like right after preseason. And, so I don't really know what like who was sort of spearheading that narrative within the Mavericks front office. You can have our assumptions, whether that be Cuban or Nico Harrison. I'm sure that everybody would probably hop on the Cuban bandwagon I would if I had to guess.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily know where that arises. Obviously, the Mavericks didn't have in honesty, like they didn't have a ton of flexibility after Brunson left. It's not unless they swung a trade, which they still have the ability to do, by the way. It's not like they were going to go get the cure-all third ball handler, and they're still not really in the position to do that. But there were some different guys on minimum deals. Obviously, you referenced Dragic. Schroeder was available during the offseason.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Mavericks were really ever in contention to sign him, but there were some different fixes some different workarounds, and the Mavericks, just neglected it completely, went into training camp without that third ball handler, and then came out of it realizing they needed one. And, I do think that, I don't think it's a major issue because I don't know if they had any like sort of needle movers that they would have been able to sign over the offseason before getting into camp that I'm like regretting now. I think that they're at least, while the situation is definitely not tended to, and I still think it's a prevalent issue, like I think that that's pretty easily distinguishable. That Hardy is just not there yet, especially from a playmaking perspective. I'd rather have him eat up minutes and, further his development. That's just my personal opinion. Than, Kemba, mildly contributing in a way that doesn't really move the needle, or, Campazzo doing the same. I'd rather have Hardy get those minutes. I think you bring up a great point there. And while it's not best case scenario, and idealistically the Mavericks, would have another third ball handler to be able to tend to all those needs right now, in the best case scenario, one that pushes Dinwiddie down to a bench, that who knows when we're going to get that. I'd rather, and go out instead of signing like X other, veteran free agent at some point this season. I do like Hardy's ascension into that role. And, even if it's, if you win one more game by substituting a veteran point guard like DJ Augustine in there, like I'd rather have Hardy just for the developmental reasons. So I think I would reciprocate most of the things you said there.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Next, let's go ahead and segue into Luka Doncic and his positioning into the MVP conversation. Obviously, this has been his best season to date. I'll look at his season statistics here momentarily. But I just wanted to like quickly ask you, where is he on your MVP ladder? This is not really something that we've had time to get to amidst our post-game pods. We obviously talk very glowingly about Luka and talk about his role on the team and, just everything that he does and how amazing he is and how prevalent and essential he is to this Mavericks team. But we haven't really took a step back, outside if you follow me on, or us on Twitter rather, at mainstream_Mavs, where, we'll essentially, or occasionally rather, get into some of those topics of discussion, be like, oh, Luka's win MVP on this, but I haven't really got into it on the podcast. So where are you at in terms of where you think Luka is in terms of the MVP standings right now?
Yeah, I think if you asked me this question, probably about a month and a half ago, I would say, he's definitely in the top three, but not my number one. I probably would have put Tatum or Jokic or even Giannis over him. But as of, what's the date? As of January 11th, 2023, he would definitely be my number one in that list. I think the things that Luka has done, especially in that 7-game stretch where, you put up 50, 60, and then another 50-point game all within, a week. That stretch alone just elevates him into another level of basketball that none of the guys that he is playing with can even compete with. And that alone, I think, is the reason why he's a number one contender for me. So I guess, yeah, I mean, I said it just now, he's my number one guy. I don't think there's anybody close. Of course, the polling would say different. I don't even think he's in the top 3 anymore, which is just really unfortunate. And, with the Mavericks sort of woes at the beginning of the season, I could definitely understand why he wasn't in the top 5 of even consideration. But with, the recent success that they've had over the last 10 games, I just think it's hard to not put him in there. But nonetheless, I think currently he's 4th in voting with I'll pull up his averages right here. 34 points per game. Let's see, he has 8 rebounds, almost 9 rebounds a game, almost 9 assists a game, almost 2 steals a game. These are just incredible stats. He's shooting 35% from 3, which is an incredible feat. 58% from the field. Just incredible numbers that he's been putting up all season long. And to me, he's undisputably the number one MVP candidate, in my opinion.
Yeah, and he's running the table away on like a lot of these advanced stats yet. I'm not, occasionally I'll dive into advanced stats on Twitter and things of that nature, but I'm not just going to go sit here and like list off all his numbers in regard to his, offensive box plus minus and everything. I don't think it's an actual stat, but I'm not going to go off the top and just list every single prerequisite and stat as to why Luka should be MVP. But he's running the table on a lot of advanced stats. Like I know he leads the category in VORP, which is, typically a pretty esteemed marker in terms of distinguishing like the best players in the league and like, at the top, from honestly like top down. And there's just a bunch of things that he's like, running the table in over Jokic, which a lot of people's main argument was, Jokic has, led that camp for so long, but now Luka is finally in the driver's seat on a lot of these, quintessential, advanced stats in terms of, the certain like hallmarks of an MVP. Right. And, I think maybe because of how Luka has had to carry some of these games, I think this may have had some unintended ripple effects that hurt his MVP conversation potentially. Not even to his own fault. I think it's largely unfair, but maybe there's a certain, because of the whole sort of prerogative of, oh, get Luka help, by Mavs fans that's starting to catch wind within national media. Maybe that by default starts, national media voters and national media, coverage to maybe start to think of the narrative that the Mavericks have a bad record or a bad team if they haven't like watched too much of the Mavericks. Which obviously we don't think the Mavericks are the best team in the world, but to say that they have a bad record, it's would obviously just be objectively untrue. Like they are 23-19. It's not insane, and it's not gaudy or moving the needle into me considering them a contender or anything. But it's a solid record. And you look back to Jokic last year, whose team was in a relatively similar position. I think Luka and Jokic have a very obviously wildly different in terms of their styles, but I think in terms of their overall defensive impact on the game, it's fairly comparable. And, Jokic has won back-to-back MVPs. Luka, loses 1 or 2 games and he's seemingly out of the MVP conversation.
Yeah.
It does seem like it's a bit unfair in terms of that amidst the, you listen to our podcast every day, you hear us talk about his play style and all the different things he does in terms of what, how beneficial he is to this team. You really understand. And I'm sure, if you're listening to this, you've obviously definitely can easily distinguish and understand the plethora of reasons as to, why Luka Doncic is as good as he is. And, for him to, legitimately be spearheading and essentially being the only reason that the Mavericks are where they are to an extent. And for him to, get this perceived, I wouldn't say disrespect, but, maybe, unfair criticism to an extent, or unfair critique from national media in terms of his standing in the MVP race, and wrapped to posting some other guys who he has beat out in advanced stats, some of which his team's record is almost as good as.
Yeah.
Despite, I get some of those guys at the top over Luka have technical better team records, but for having his team in a position where they are, it's very comparable to like what Jokic did last year, like I said, yet Luka's playing even better offensively versus Jokic last year. I mean, I think Jokic last year and in the last 2 years has obviously been insane, but I think Luka's impact on the game goes even beyond that, just with how much he's asked to do in terms of being a primary ball handler. I think that's the main distinguishment. That was probably the only like marker that would, say, okay, like Luka's doing more for this team. And I mean, if we're going, by that litmus test, like I just don't see why he isn't the clear front runner up until this point. If the Mavericks slide and they ended up finishing in that play-in echelon, that's a totally different story. But to have them where he has them at this point in the season, doing, just his counting stats, his advanced stats, how he's affected the game on all levels, improved even if it's just slightly and marginally, he's improved a little bit as a defender. He's at the apex in terms of his athleticism, how it's ever been in the NBA. I just don't see why he's the leader in the clubhouse. And, you can call us biased because we're a Mavs podcast. And obviously we don't have time to, go into counter arguments as to why the other candidates shouldn't win. I do all amazing players, but I think Luka just is in a club of his own right now, even ahead more so those other guys. And, I don't have, we don't have the time, unfortunately, today to, if it's something later in the season and, and the awards come out and the Mavericks are out of the playoffs, we'll definitely go more into it.
Yeah.
But, unfortunately, we don't have the time today to like iron out why he should be over X candidate and compare candidates accordingly. But nonetheless, like, I think having watched this team every day and, still watching the NBA in general on a consistent basis, both of us, our unbiased opinion, taking our Mavericks fanship away, would agree that he should be the MVP of the league.
No, I mean, without a doubt. I know that he's the number one offense in the league throughout the whole season has been the Boston Celtics with like 120 points per game or 120 points per 100 possessions. Luka Doncic being on the court elevates the Mavericks into a 121 point per 100 possessions. And I mean, just that stat alone, I mean, I think just triumphs any other counter stat that you can prove.
No, like 100%. Obviously it wouldn't be sustainable for Luka to play 48 minutes in a game, but theoretically, if he kept up his same pace of production for 48 minutes, basically as the sole engine of the Mavericks offense, he would lead them to the best offense in the league with the limitations of this team. I mean, it's just wildly impressive as a stat, despite, how it may not be applicable to certain situations and things. I mean, those some of his on-off numbers in terms of how the Mavericks are and are without him. He's just running the floor compared to any other candidate. And I mean, there's no argument to be made there, as he definitely means the most to this team versus I think anybody. I think he means the most to his team versus any other player in the league. I think that's objectively.
Yeah. No, that's for sure. Don't quote me on this, but I believe whenever Luka's on the floor and in half court offense, they have like the number one half court offense in NBA history.
Wow.
Yeah, and the guy is 23 years old. So
yeah.
I mean,
no, yeah, I mean, I haven't seen that stat thrown out there, but I mean, if that's true, that's.
I think it was. I know Cato threw something out there like it may have been either this season but I believe it was like over a decade or. I feel a little weird saying the history, but yeah, I think it was like over the last decade or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's insane. Next up, we've talked obviously about Luka and the MVP discussion, the Mavericks third ball handler situation, this team's identity. Let's keep this one a little more brief, but if we're speaking comparatively, this team versus last year's team, what are some of the common denominators that be like, oh, like the Mavericks have some of these good characteristics from last year? I think that this could carry over come playoff time. I'm really excited about that. And obviously, like, what are the fallouts? What does this team not have that they had last year?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely some similarities between this year's and last year's team, and there's definitely some vast how do you get the
similarities.
word? Yeah, to this year's and last year's team. I guess I'll start out with the negatives. I mean, last year's team clearly had a way better defense. They were somehow ranked inside the top 10, one of the better defenses in the league. Meanwhile, this defense, granted, they've had their mishaps on injuries and all that, being that their top 3 defenders are out. I mean, this team isn't even a top 25 defensive team in the NBA. Also, Jalen Brunson, that's an underlying factor. I think we can just leave it at that. The third ball handler situation has definitely not been as much of a esteemed role as it was last year. And I think that's, simply putting it. But nonetheless, I think last year it was just a different kind of, cog to the team. Whenever we played the Boston Celtics, the Grizzlies, all these good teams, the Warriors last year, it was easily, it was fun to watch. Meanwhile, this season, we saw it in this Clippers game just this night, and the Boston game last week, where the Mavericks are just simply outmanned time and time again because they just cannot compete with these contending teams, whether it be in the East or West. And I think that's seriously like the biggest difference. Now, similarities. I think that this team, they have the, I guess, same sort of potent offense, whether it be, just strictly with Luka or, the pick and roll offense. In this case, it's with Christian Wood. Last year it was with Dwight Powell. But nonetheless, I just don't think there's very many similarities that are as contracting as the, I guess, negatives, put aside from year to year. But with that being said, I think that this team is in, you can argue, a better position than they were at this point of the season last year. I don't know exactly 41 games in whenever we were, but I do know that we were like 17-19 at one point last year. And meanwhile, we're sitting at 23-19. So I just think, if you take those two looks, you'll say, okay, well, this team's better. But I mean, last year, simply put it, they were able to compete against the Boston Celtics, the Warriors, and everything like that. This year, I mean, it's just not even a game at some points.
Yeah, but of course, like obviously the Mavericks had their insane midseason turnaround last year.
Yeah.
That definitely added to the whole. That definitely adds a lot of color to our conversation in terms of analyzing this team. Last year versus now, and how good this team was at this point last year versus now. Could the Mavericks still still undergo that same drastic change and become all of a sudden this contender, within a matter of a month or two? I mean, theoretically they could the defense just, flip on its head completely? I think that there's credence to the fact that that could happen, but I do want to preface that the one denominator that was not there last year that, was something that kind of aided to the Mavericks getting off to that rough start. Really two things. A lot of it first was Luka not being really prevalent in the rotation amidst having kind of a slew of beginning of the season injuries to deal with and some COVID stuff. A lot of the Mavericks role players were out with some COVID stuff, and that, when that second surge hit that around Christmas time, that definitely worked to kind of backtrack the Mavericks and the trajectory of how good the team was at the time and things of that nature, as well as Luka, coming in from that off season. He obviously was not in the absolute pinnacle of his shape, having just come off an Olympics run with Slovenia in Beijing. And, so there's a few different factors as to why that team got off to as slow of a start as it did. And, for this Mavericks team to kind of, being slightly above treading water in terms of the record, I think definitely treading water just in terms of how good they are from a talent perspective. Yet Luka has basically led the MVP conversation, as we just alluded to. That, I think, is the biggest stark difference from last year's team to this year's team.
No, I mean,
in my humble opinion. But I think all the points you brought up were great in terms of how you talked about the interrelatedness that we did have last year, regarding the offense and everything. Like, yes, the Mavericks still have a fairly hyper efficient offense when it's humming, and when Luka is performing at the pinnacle of his game. Is it different than last year? Yes. Vastly different, of course, with the whole Christian Wood and Jalen Brunson dynamic, those obviously changing, your offensive play style up marginally and what have you. But at the end of the day, the common denominator of Luka still persists, and he's been the engine behind a dominant offense 2 years in a row now, and they're still a really good offense. We maintain a lot of the defensive personnel that we had last year. It's not like we really lost any of it. I guess I don't want to harp on this too much, but what do you think is the reason that the Mavericks defense may have fell off some?
I mean, to be honest, I think the only reason why they were even a top 5 defense last year was guys were able to fill in roles and buy in. And I just don't think that's the case this year. I just think there's too much individuality whenever it comes to defense. I mean, there's definitely a lack of rim protecting and everything. Teams are able to attack the paint as they were last year in the playoffs. And also, I mean, injuries aside, I mean, this team isn't even just equipped to, defend the Western Conference just in general. I think the Western Conference, they've gotten a lot healthier comparatively to last season. You have Clippers, you have the Warriors, you have everything. Every team basically has, a set of rules that they'll play against the Mavericks, while they couldn't do that last year due to injuries. And I just think that's honestly a big difference. But yeah, I just think definitely, submitting guys in the rotation, submitting guys out of the rotation. Reggie Bullock, he hasn't been amazing as he was last year. Dorian, he's gotten off to a slow start as well. I just think, those definitely they are, I'm losing track of words here. They definitely,
almost 3:30 a.m. for those of you guys.
Yeah, no, that's exactly why. Those are definitely, the reasons why this team just defensively isn't the same as they were last year.
No, I think I would definitely concur from that standpoint. I think that this team, while they do maintain a lot of the personnel that they had last year, I just think a lot of the principles don't carry over. I think that, when you get a new head coach who brings in a new defensive scheme for the first time, to like a new place, of course, with all this personnel, it's not something that anybody really has lined up on their scouting report. I think that they were able to be the benefactors of that quite a bit last year, just, and just in terms of how synced their team defense was, like you alluded to. You talked a little bit about how some like the individual defensive performance from guys like Dorian or Reggie fell off a little bit, and that's part of it as well. But having to incorporate some new pieces like Christian Wood and JaVale McGee, get them to learn the defensive scheme, and just shifting guys in and out in terms of where their place is in the rotation. That's obviously going to lead to your defense in terms of its hyper efficiency last year being rattled a little bit when you're changing up the who all is getting the exact certain minutes and certain roles, things of that nature. It's definitely going to change up the schematics a little bit of your defense. And I'm sure the teams have a little more tape on the Mavericks defense now after Jason Kidd's first year as head coach is under his belt here. So, I mean, I think that those are all pretty good reasons as to why the defense is not flourishing as much as it could last year. I think, order of operations, number one, to fix that issue is, try to get better personnel.
Yeah.
But also maybe, now that we've seen times where things are starting to turn around, obviously the Mavericks recent slide, you can attribute, I don't know if they're 25th best or even less than that in the league.
I think they're like 26th as of right now. So
yeah, because I mean they were quite a bit higher at the beginning of the year when they had all their personnel. So I don't think they're that bad, but upon their personnel getting back, there's still another step that they'll have to take defensively, even when those guys get back. And when those guys get back, how much is that going to be able to help the current rendition of this defense? Like, how much can they progress internally without adding anybody? That's going to be interesting to see. I would definitely reconcile kind of what you said there. So, kind of just to go off that, what do you think is the most pressing need for this team right now? You don't really have to speak positionally like, a point guard, but like what type of player does this Mavericks need more than anything right now, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, more than anything, especially with what kind of injuries have toppled over onto this team, You asked me this question a month and a half ago, I probably would have said a third ball handler, but at this point we have Jaden Hardy, and I think he's like the most stable guy out of all the three signings that we've made, or all two signings that we've made at that position. But for me personally, I think the biggest need has to be a rim protector. It's just simple as that. With JaVale McGee, with his lack of emergence on this roster, it's sort of become a bigger need than it should be, especially with the injury due to Maxi Kleber, who's basically looked at as our own rim protector. But nonetheless, I think that's probably the biggest need. I think if we can fill in that role, that'll definitely take a huge toll in upping this team's productiveness on defense. But I mean, to me, that's probably the most important piece to fill.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it really, for all Mavs fans, I think the three needs that you would probably diagnose on this team are a third ball handler, or not even necessarily having to be a guard. Like, it could be a wing that's a third ball handler, but
Yeah,
a third ball handler, a 3-and-D wing with an aspect that isn't just completely one dimensional, particularly like a younger guy at that position, and then probably a rim protector. And I mean, for me personally, I would be, I guess, sort of optimistic and altruistic in my hopes for a guy that kind of encompasses those first two categories. Like, that is the most idealistic patch for this Mavericks team. If they could get, a 3-and-D player who also offers a creation aspect to him and a playmaking, and he has, the playmaking attributes that carry him to, honestly, like, come in here and, be one of the better 3-and-D wings on the team, as well as a guy that can help alleviate pressure from Luka and Spencer. And, like, I mean, if he's of that ilk, the unfortunate part is that he's probably an all-star, right? And he's probably
yeah,
at that upper echelon of players. There is obviously not like a ton of those guys in the league. But a guy that could, I think my idealistic guy that I would hope the Mavericks to get would be a mix between a 3-and-D wing, of course, and just a that third ball handler, playmaker, shot creator, however you want to label it. I'm not saying that he's going to be the cure-all for either of those holes, but if he could give me a little bit of both, I think that would serve this team the best, because I don't know if they can get multiple guys to patch all these holes. I just don't know if they're going to have that luxury. But that's not to say that I don't think a rim protector is important or anything like that. I just think the Mavericks can get by for a while with Christian Wood, but I definitely think that does have a shelf life. And if we're just talking about, if we're ranking all those positions separately, and I don't have like the ability to make that little like hybrid spot, then I honestly would probably put a rim protector number one ahead of both of those ones.
yeah. I mean, for me, I think if you just look at the playoff run last year, they of course had the 3D aspect pretty filled up. Definitely could have used another one, but the third ball handler role was definitely filled. The one hole was a rim protector, and we saw what happened to them in the Western Conference Finals with Kevon Looney basically putting whatever he chose to do on the Mavericks. And I just think that, granted, if we got, that 3-and-D hybrid sort of ball handler guy, that would still be the same need that this team needs.
No, 100%. That's a great point you put up there. I mean, and that's why, like, if we're talking like individually, I would definitely probably go with the rim protector. It's just, the whole Brunson left is just, it definitely it catches up to me at points, when I'm like analyzing this team big picture. So, with that being said, we kind of diagnosed the specific need that this team would have in terms of like what we thought a specific player that we'd like them to get, just in terms of, well, not like a specific player, but a style player rather. What do you think are the most expendable players on this team, or who are the most expendable players on this team right now out of like, the current guys in the rotation? Obviously, I'm not talking like, oh, like Frank Ntilikina, he could be a throw in on the trade, or, if you had to put in Theo Pinson in a trade, like, I'm not talking about like just the flat out worst guys on the roster, but who is the most expendable on the team, like needs to leave, just isn't fulfilling their roles like you'd like to, things of that nature.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna rank these guys like top to bottom, I guess. There's 3 guys on this list. I guess number 1 who has to go is probably Davis Bertans. I mean, we're paying him what I think it's like 16.2 million to shoot and make 3-pointers, and he's doing one half of those. He's shooting the 3-pointers. He's just not making them at an insane clip. I think, especially with that egregious contract, you just have to see him on a different roster. Money reasons alone. Next coming up, I think, is Reggie Bullock. Again, I mean, I love Reggie and all, but the defense just isn't hitting at enough clip to where it's offsetting his horrible offense. I know he's sort of like flattened out in terms of his shooting, but even still, it's just not an amazing clip that helps this team whatsoever. And then third, I think, comes Tim Hardaway Jr. He's played insane this season. I think he's shooting the 3-ball at the volume that he's shooting at. I think he's like shooting 36%, which is just an insane clip. But nonetheless, I just think if the Mavericks are wanting a different identity for Luka in the Luka era, they have to go away from Tim. I said this a while ago on the pod, or a minute ago on the podcast, but even still, I just think Tim is probably your best asset to trade outside of Christian Wood, outside of Spencer Dinwiddie. And I just think that those are probably the 3 guys that are probably the most expendable and most flexible. And 2 of the 3 are definitely super, what do you call it? Like D- negative assets in that one.
Yeah, no, I think that you bring up a good point there, because I mean, like, I kind of missed the mark exactly on like what you were saying at the beginning of the podcast. When you were talking about Tim being this sort of like, basically like, the transition from the next era of Mavericks basketball to the next one, whenever we end up trading him and acquiring somebody else. But I mean, to an extent, it does make sense. Like, between the guys that are like definitively tradable, and I mean, I'm sure, like, I'm not, if the Mavericks got the right phone call for Christian Wood or whoever, they're not going to turn a blind eye to it. I'm like, there's obviously some things we'll get into it with that later, but if we're talking about the guys that have purely just from a fit standpoint or have just underperformed to their contract, I'm going to go a step further. I actually have 5 guys here.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to be.
Well, I refuse to put JaVale in there. So
You're okay. Fair enough. Yeah. No, I mean, JaVale, he has somewhat of a role in this team. So I think that his inclusion was needed, just in terms of, I think, how dire the sort of urge to get him off the team might be at this point, now that his contract has turned from, it's a little bit of an overpay to that's completely horrendous, right? But I think I would definitely reciprocate that Davis is like everything you said about Davis, I reciprocate 100%. Definitely about Reggie as well. I would definitely have those guys as my first 2, and in terms of leaders of the clubhouse that I would like to have my parting thoughts with. But and by no means am I saying like I like hate these guys or don't like them or like want them off the team immediately. But if I'm getting something decent in return, like, these are the guys that I'd be moving first. Next up, I would probably go JaVale. The only reason I don't put JaVale ahead of those other 2 guys is because of his contract not being, too much of a hit on the Mavericks at that, $5 million mark. I mean, yes, it's egregious. It's an egregious overpay for him, but at the end of the day, it's not like a ton of money. So it's like, kind of just swallow the pill on that one.
Yeah.
Next, I'd probably, if I had to choose, oh man. I think I'd probably go, Dwight Powell, because I think he probably is the second most between these guys. He's probably the second most tradable guy between him and Tim. I think the way Tim sort of researched himself and some of the, we've actually seen Tim come up in a few rumors for other teams. Most recently, the Cleveland Cavaliers. With, there's a big discussion on Twitter regarding him and Carousel that lots of fans are very much into. I tend to get myself into most of those. I don't know for what reason. That just seemed like the perfect storm of like me not wanting to involve myself in, as they're 2 very like narrow, limited players, but they're very good at what they do. And
Yeah.
it's just like I maybe another day. I'll get my thoughts on that on Twitter at some point, but I just haven't really formulated my thoughts on it yet, so I don't really have like the answer there quite yet. But I would probably put Dwight Powell because his role has obviously become increasingly redundant with Christian Wood's emergence.
Yeah.
And he is a pretty tradable figure at like 10 to 11 million, but I mean, he's like not terrible. Like I don't hate him or anything. So, that's why I probably put him. And then Tim, as much as we obviously shit on Tim for his defensive limitations and some of his other antics, he has a relatively tradable contract after at the beginning of the year, we thought he was just a complete albatross. And I mean, he's flipped the narrative on himself, pretty substantially.
Yeah.
Yes, he still has his, clunker 2 for 12 games, but I mean, more often than not, he follows that up with a really good shooting game. And it's the Tim Hardaway of 2019-20, back in the flesh, or 2020-2021, whatever you want to call it. And it's a sight for sore eyes. And I mean, he actually does hold value and might be able to get us something.
He
So
does.
that's why I would probably put him on last on the totem pole in terms of most expendable. So, if I had to rank it, it would probably go Davis, Reggie, JaVale, Dwight, and then Tim, between those 5. And then outside of that, I wouldn't say everybody else is like an overtly like positive asset, but they're at least neutral to positive. So, yeah, I mean, like that's probably where I would rank it. I mean, I think that that's like a great transition point into the next topic. Do you think this team actually does make a move come trade deadline time? Do you think they end up staying pat? If obviously, I'm not asking you to go too in depth here into like the Mavericks, the leaders of the Mavericks front office, their antics and what have you, what they've done in years prior. But if you just had to predict based on the needs of this team, do you think the Mavericks make a move this offseason or at the trade deadline? And if they do, how substantial will it be?
Yeah, so I think, going into this, this is kind of a tough answer with what assets the Mavs are given. Nonetheless, I do think that there's probably a move made at the trade deadline. But even still, I don't think it's the Mavericks calling the phone. I think it's the Mavericks picking up the phone. We've seen, recent Cleveland Cavalier trade rumors between them and Tim Hardaway and all that nonsense. And I probably think that's more of a scenario that we'll probably be seeing is, a team wanting a player, and that'll be more than likely Tim Hardaway. I just don't think the Mavericks have the assets to sort of trade or sort of pick, like call teams and trade for a guy, unless if it's, some negative asset. I can't really think of any off the top of my head, but I think those are probably the more real scenarios that we'll see. Now, nonetheless, how I guess major will the shakeup be? I honestly don't really think it'll be too major. I think we'll probably see it early on with just a, sort of change in the philosophy and everything like that with this team. But I don't think it's a major change that's going to be like totally needle changing in either way, negative or positive. I think it'll probably be negative for negative asset, something that doesn't change too much. And, come playoff time, we'll see if they're even in the rotation. But yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably see one trade. I just don't think the Mavericks will probably be calling other teams. I think it'll be them picking up the phone.
No, yeah, I mean that's fair enough. I kind of I guess we technically put Tim in like our negative asset section, but is he changing the conversation around him to become a positive asset? What do you think? I mean, yeah. So if we're treating Tim as a positive asset, I think that changes things, right?
For sure.
I think that I don't think that he's like some wildly like, oh, he's for sure a positive asset. But I mean, if we're like at least putting him in like that neutral range, like, maybe you're not going to get more than maybe you're not going to get like more than he's worth. Like if you trade him, but you'll at least get something equally as good in return that just may be a different piece. If we're operating under that assumption, and Tim is like, if Tim continues this till the trade deadline, I think the Mavericks will make 2 moves.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
Yeah. I think that they will find a way to unload. I don't see any way in hell that they can get off all 3 of them. but I think that they'll find a way to do some sort of negative asset for negative asset swap with one of Bertans, McGee, and Reggie. I think that they'll find a way to shuffle the deck and just get some different pieces in there for one of those guys, consolidate some seconds. I don't know exactly what the specifications of the trade would be. If they could get off two out of three of those guys, that'd be even better. And in turn, either get expirings or just some younger guys that could maybe that kind of miss the mark in terms of their development and are just looking for a new home or something like that. Nothing that I think would move the needle between those guys whatsoever. But if there's any way that they could combine any of those guys or just get off one of those, particularly Davis, obviously the main one, I think that Nico's going to pull some strings to get off one of them. That's my prediction. I think he gets off one of them. And then in tandem with that, I think they make a Tim Hardaway Jr. trade. I think they finally part ways with him. That, I think would benefit the team just from a fit aspect of whoever they're getting in return, likely. I think that what the Mavericks may do at the trade deadline may make them slightly and marginally better, but nothing that moves them into contention. That's what
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, they become more of a playoff team if anything.
I don't think that they do anything that involves giving up Jaden Hardy, Josh Green, or any of their picks, or Spencer Dinwiddie. Or, for that matter, if we're just going to go even a step further, like, there's a slight possibility that Christian Wood gets moved.
Yeah.
But I think the perfect storm would definitely have to present itself, and the perfect package would have to come about for the Mavericks to pick up the phone there. I don't think that they're picking up the phone I don't think they're like actively shopping. I'd be surprised if they're actively shopping Christian Wood.
So, regarding Christian Wood, I know that we kind of get into this, so I guess we'll kind of divert into it. Of course, there's three ways that this can go: in season extension, trade, or out of season extension. I just think regarding the trade talk wise, it has to be the right package to even consider it. I just think he's playing too well alongside Luka this season to even, kind of actively shop him, as you say. But, even still, I do see a scenario where, given the right personnel, they could probably raise some eyebrows to it, and, we could see him on a different team. But even still, I just think that he's probably a lock at this point. I don't want to say he's like a lock, but I definitely do think his home in Dallas is probably pretty safe right now.
Yes, I think that I would concur with that, at least for maybe the rest of the season. I definitely have some differing opinions in terms of I do think the Mavericks should extend him at that figure, or at least offer it if they haven't.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's malpractice because as soon as the cap spikes, 4 years, $77 million is just too good of a deal for him, in my opinion. I don't think that they should play the waiting game and, basically involve themselves in another potential Brunson situation unless there's communication at the forefront beforehand. They're like, hey, like, we think you're worth more than this. We're going to sign you for more in the offseason. I just don't think they can afford to lose him for nothing. If they have a preconceived notion that they're going to lose him for nothing and they end up trading him, then because Cuban's too stingy to pay the luxury tax, it's one of those things that, yes, it'll suck at the end of the day, and we'll probably be regretful and we'll probably be mad that they couldn't bite the apple and just re-sign him or give him the extension, and they had to be stingy. But at least they didn't lose him for nothing like Brunson.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a real delicate situation, but if I had to pick a side, I hope he stays. I've voiced this on the podcast many times. I'm definitely more in the Wood camp than I am not. But it's a delicate situation to monitor, and I would hope that they could extend him before that July 1st deadline. But we'll see. Because to my knowledge, to really everybody's, nobody knows if they've offered the extension or not, but it doesn't seem like they have. So
yeah, no, I don't.
Obviously, Tim McMahon has reported that they're more keen to only extending him 2 years so they can keep the powder dry and maintain flexibility in 2025 free agency, which is malpractice in itself because I don't even want to begin to go over the whole history of planned powder and all that sort of shit. But I don't know. I just hope they don't screw it up, but I'm very fearful that they do. that's something we'll definitely monitor. If he's not extended by the offseason, we're going to monitor even more so. But as of right now, my personal thoughts and what I would hope that they would do would be to extend him at that 4 for 77 figure. But I do think that there's credence to the fact that that might not be what they do. I think they might be holding out to the offseason to see what he's worth. That is what I would predict is what they were going to do.
Yeah, I'm with you on that boat. I just think he's too good to let walk. If we let him walk, I think that fits the narrative of malpractice in itself. You can at least get some sort of value for this guy.
No, yeah, like 100%.
Mhm.
And next up, before we go ahead and wrap this thing up, we're just going to go ahead and get into some predictions for the end of the year in terms of what we think the Mavericks record will be when they finish at the end of the year, where we thought they would be right now in terms of the record. And we'll give a brief debrief on every player up until this point in the season, if we think they've over or underperformed. So let's go ahead and segue into that conversation. Jaren, where do you think the Mavericks, or where did you think coming into this season the Mavericks would be record-wise at the halfway marker of the season?
Yeah, so through 41 games, 23-18 sitting at. I'm going to be honest, I think that this is kind of what I thought they'd be. I figured they'd get off to maybe a little bit of a slower start with just the different lineups that they didn't have last year. So I think mid-season wise, I think that they'd be a little bit over 500, but they're sitting at 5 games over 500. I guess 4 after this 42nd game with the Clippers. But towards the end of the season, me personally, I projected them. I feel like at that 48 win mark, and I would say they're online to do so. But I would still defer to probably that 45 to 47 range personally. I think that there's a very small window of opportunity that they can probably get 50, but that's if everything hits with the trade market. But nonetheless, I think that they probably at the end of the season probably will go 46 and 36, I think is what it would be. I think it's right there. But I think that's probably where they'd be at.
Yeah, for me personally, I definitely predicted that they would be in this sort of range. Halfway through the season, 23-18. Technically 23-19 after the Clippers game, but I definitely felt like they would be in that echelon record wise. But I guess I just didn't foresee as rocky of a path to get there.
Yeah.
I feel like they would be a better team if they were this good. So that definitely leads me to have some skepticism going forward. Just in terms of how they're going to fare towards the end of the season. But at the same time, I don't know what this team is until, if trade deadline plays out, if they're able to make any moves regarding that, if they're able to actually build somewhat of an identity when they get some of these guys back from injury. So I'm just going to play it on the safe side. And I'm going to say by the end of the season, they're going to be 44 and 38, but that's at the the absolute bottom end of things. That's just if they honestly kind of just tread water from where they're at right now and don't even really marginally improve. Obviously you never know, things could end up being worse, things could be better, but I think I reciprocate that the absolute high end, if everything was to go right, they could get in that 50 range. If everything was just to fall off completely, I could see them being under 500.
Really?
Yeah.
I just don't see any scenario where, unless if Luka gets hurt, I just don't really see any scenario.
No, if they, I just look at the volume of their wins, and I just still see a ton of flaws with this game. They've had a weaker strength of schedule up until this point in the season. I think at the absolute worst case scenario, they're not terribly far off from right now. I think if everything were to hit the fan, I could, another injury or two, I could see them being 500.
I could see them being 500.
When I meant under 500, I meant by a game or two. I wasn't talking about
well, I know.
Games under 500, but man, I could see it.
Yeah. I think as far as playoff seeding goes, I definitely, I think, they've, especially after that 7-game win streak, however flawed it was, I think that they probably upped themselves into a playoff echelon, whereas I don't think they were at that point earlier.
You think that they're totally?
I think they're a playoff lock. I think they're
Wow.
they're not a top 3 seed, There's a small chance they can reach a 3 seed, but I think that they're a 6 to 4 seed lock in my opinion.
I mean, with just how with volatile the West is right now, I am not comfortable personally putting them past the play-in. Like they could very well still end up there, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I mean, I definitely obviously think it helps. They're definitely like, I mean, at least you said that you feel like they're probably not a lock for home court. I think they likely end up somewhere in the 5 to 8 range. In terms of what will happen.
Yeah.
If I had to guess, I would probably guess like 6 or 7, but I preface that saying that they could probably go as late. I mean, they could the absolute like worst case scenario, I could see this team ending up in like the bottom half of the play in, like the 9th seed or something like that. Like it's not like really far fetched with how condensed the West is.
No, I mean, I think there would be an amazing team.
And then like the absolute high end, like if they just really hit their stride in the if they hit their stride and they were able to make a trade that benefited them more so than we thought, like a Dinwiddie-esque trade from last year, I could see them getting as high as 3, but that's like, those are the extremes of both ends in terms of where I could see them going.
I completely agree. I think, the very least that they can go, in my opinion, is probably that 7 to 8 seed. I know you said 9. I just don't see that happening, but I think if everything hits and, the season goes well and Luka doesn't get hurt and everybody starts playing amazing, Reggie Bullock starts, hitting his stride, whatever, 3 seed, I think, is probably the top.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Next up, we're just going to go and do some like play reviews. I'm not going to go like wildly in depth into any of these, of course, but just before we end the podcast, we want to kind of hash these out in terms of, saying if a guy's underperformed, if you've been pleasantly surprised by a guy, or he's kind of like, been relatively around what your expectations for him were at the beginning of the season. And, obviously, give a brief reasoning as to why you picked what you picked. You don't have to really, we talked glowingly about Luka already in his MVP conversation. So you can kind of just tell me what you've thought about him when we get to him, of course. But barring that, everybody else is open up for discussion in terms of what you think their standing is on the team right now, and if they've over or underperformed. So I mean, with that being said, I mean, I guess let's just start off with Luka. Has he exceeded or has he underachieved in terms of your expectations for him going into this year?
I think he's really under exceeded. I'm just playing. That's a joke. He's definitely over exceeded. He's sitting at an A+. I mean, there's no discussion there. He's the team at times.
Yeah, no, like 100%. Even if I did expect him to play him, like be at an MVP level, I mean, he's at another.
He's way exceeded my expectation of what an MVP could be. So
yes, exactly. What has Davis Bertans? Is he overachieved or is he underachieved for you, Jaren?
I mean, I hate to say it, but if we're putting a grade on it, I would probably say like a D-. He's definitely underachieved. He's somehow found a lesser role. And that's
in all fairness, while his contract was still an albatross and while he was still seen as like a negative asset just because of how much he was getting paid, he did have some like decent contributions, especially during the playoff run last year, and he was hitting
playoff run, yeah.
And he was running out in transition. I mean, yes, he played bad defense, but occasionally he at least had some decent recoveries. Like this year, he just can't do anything on offense.
No,
I mean, he's just nothing. So I would definitely agree. Let's go on to Reggie Bullock. Has he over or underachieved for you this year, Jaren?
Definitely under. Grade wise as well. I'm just going to be putting in a grade on everybody. I'd probably put him at a C-. I think, a little hopes is still glimpsing of could we get Reggie Bullock of old back? But nonetheless, I just think, everything that he's done this. Yeah, I was like, everything that he's done this season and how much he's regressed. I just, he's definitely underwhelmingly become a part of that negative aspect of the team.
I would definitely agree. Next up, we got Spencer Dinwiddie. Has he over, underachieved, stayed the same? What were your expectations going for him into the season? How has he fared so far?
Yeah, I mean, this one's, I'm going to be honest, this is kind of a hard one, but I'm going to put Spencer at a B+. I think that he's done everything he's been able to do, given the role that he's been given. I mean, he shot the three ball at an insane like 40 or 44% clip or something like that on catch and
It
shoot
definitely
threes.
fell off since then. I can check what it's.
Well, he's fallen off the past few weeks. That I think that's where the grade drops. But nonetheless, I think that he's done a pretty good job of running the second unit when given, and when alongside Luka, he does make his 3-point shots. I think that's really all that you can ask of him right now. I think if we were given the opportunity to get a third ball handler or given a second star along Luka, whatever it would be, I think he'd probably fall into his role that he had last year, and that would better suit him than it does now.
I would agree. I think he stepped up to an extent versus
Yeah.
what he had last year. I was skeptical about his position on this team last year, just from the stand or going into this season rather. After he had really up and down playoffs. Like he had some really good games and some really bad games, and I was very skeptical as to how the shooting would carry over. So I'm gonna take the slide over on this one as well because the shooting has definitely came into fruition more so than I could have ever imagined. Even though he has fallen off a little bit, like it's still been solid and he's been operating in the mid range well. But I will say, like, there still feels like he's not being as assertive in recent weeks in terms of being able to get to the rim as I would have hoped, and that he was doing at the very beginning of the season. So that's why I only take the slide over, or else I would definitely take like a larger over. But I think in totality, he definitely has exceeded my expectations if I have to swing one way or another. What do you think about Dorian Finney-Smith, Jaren? Is he underachieved or overachieved for your standards this year?
I just don't think we've seen enough of him to really like grade his, whole aspect of the season. I would probably go along the lines of saying he's under exceeded just because of, what we have seen from him. It hasn't been all too great. Needless to say, it did pick up before his injury. But even still, I just don't think it really fit the narrative of him like improving as much as we thought he would heading into the season. Grade wise, I'd probably give him like a C or C plus. I just don't think we've seen enough, of course. I think he'll be better come, this injury, but I mean, bottom line, I just don't think we've seen enough of him.
Yeah, no, I think that that's pretty fair. At the same time, like I also don't know how much like marginal improvements there was for him to make.
Yeah,
He's really kind of at the pinnacle of the prime of his career. He's 29 right now. Probably playing his best basketball as he ever will. I like I said, I also definitely reciprocate that. I just don't think there's been a big enough sample size for me to really effectively grade him. So I would probably just say that he's performed up to standard, like around what I thought he was going to be. But definitely like taking that into consideration that he just hasn't got enough like games and a sample size to really like show me that narrative should be skewed one way or the other. Because like the very beginning of the season, the defense and the 3-point shooting had like a really it had a rough little like week or two, but then he had like a really good week for another week or two, then fell off for another time. So it's been like really just kind of up and down. So
yeah.
I'm just excited to see him to get back, and we'll see how the consistency is. But if I guess I had to grade it in its totality, I guess I'd say just kind of stay the same. I think that this is probably the most obvious one of the day, maybe outside of Luka, but has Josh Green over or under achieved on your expectations?
Who the mountains? I mean, this guy is like exceeded. I think he's probably in the runnings for most improved player of the year if he didn't have that big injury that took him out for a few weeks. But I mean, this guy deserves probably an A. I just don't the improvements that he's made on his game have just been too big to not notice. And that alone, I think, just puts him in an echelon of over exceeding comparatively.
I mean, like he's improved marginally in every single facet of his game. I would push back on the whole most improved thing, not because I don't think he's worthy of it, because national media tends to gravitate those guys who went from the 6-man or the starter level players to like all-star players. They tend to look at those sort of jumps versus like, oh, I'm a decent role player to a starter level role player. They're usually less keen on giving most improved. But like in terms of if he should be in that contention, like he should be, if he hadn't missed all these games, then I think he be a guy that's in that conversation. So I mean, yeah, like there's without a doubt that I would reciprocate what you said. What do you think about Tim Hardaway Jr.? Is he over or underachieved your expectations this year?
I'm going to say, I don't know what you think about this, but I think that he's probably over exceeded my expectation. I think coming into the season, I didn't really expect him to shoot the ball at this clip that he has been. I mean, it was definitely a rocky start. At times, I would probably pick Tyler Dorsey over him, but needless to say, he's come into his own. I mean, he's played pretty good basketball outside of like his few stinkers. He has every now and then, but I think he's definitely leveled out and he's become, unfortunately or fortunately, however you look at it, he's become a pivotal piece on this offense.
Yeah, I think I would have to concur. I'd probably take the slide over if anything. I wouldn't say that he's completely stagnated out in terms of what my expectations were for him, or he's like, in that sort of tier of, yeah, like this is about what I expected of him. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I don't think that if you couple his performance in terms of how he's playing right now with how bad his start to the season was, I definitely wouldn't like say it's like by some insane margin that I'm saying that he's exceeded my expectations. It's a pretty slim margin. But I mean, I think in summation that he probably has. Just in terms of, yes, like he'll have a bad game every now and then, and I get the shooting's volatile, but he's kind of slowly remediating those bad games with the good games pretty steadily here. So, I coming off his injury, I really don't know where my expectations were for him coming into the season, but I don't think they were insanely high, just maybe to be not a liability in terms of the shots he's taking and to play steady. And while amidst him not doing that the first few weeks of the season, he's definitely righted the ship. So I'd probably agree. Where are your thoughts for Jaden Hardy in terms of if he's over or under exceeded so far this year?
I mean, I would say he's over. I just don't even think that we really even wrote him a chance to get him a pivotal role on this team at the start of the season. It was more so like a treat if we got to see him, and I think we've got to see him in enough minutes to call him a luxury. And honestly, that's where I would stick it. I wouldn't put him like overly over, but I think marginally over is probably where I would stick him at.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, he hasn't done enough for me to be like, oh, he's had a few good games for sure that definitely got us excited, but he hasn't done anything to like put my expectations for him over the roof or anything like that. But he's, like you alluded to, like we didn't know what his role was even going to be at this season, at this point in the season, if he'd even be playing. So I would definitely say over from that standpoint. Has Maxi Kleber over or under exceeded your expectations this year?
This one's tough. This is probably like one of the most middle line guys. His 3-point shooting hasn't been there majority of the season. Defensive woes. There was a little bit of defensive woes coming into the season.
He did those last few weeks before he was getting injured. We always talked about in the podcast how he's quietly like being a pretty essential cog for this Mavericks team.
No, I mean, and we see it now with him out of the rotation due to injury. But needless to say, I would probably stick him at the middle of the line. I just, again, we haven't seen enough to grade him too hard. I just think, I guess what was expected of him just kind of wasn't. And JaVale with his whole thing not helping, that definitely didn't help. But I wouldn't put him overly positive, but I wouldn't put him overly negative.
I think I would agree with you there. If we're taking injuries aside, which I guess is only fair since I didn't do that for Dorian or Josh, then yeah, I would definitely put him in that middle tier. Just because like the athleticism looks like sometimes he's lost a step, sometimes he hasn't, but he steadily started providing positive minutes out of nowhere. So I would tend to agree with you there. I don't think it's like if we're taking the hamstring tear into account, obviously it's a negative just for the amount of time he's missed. But if we're not, then yes, like for sure, I would definitely take the middle of the line there. Do we want to do any of the former Mavericks and Kemba Walker and Facu Campazzo? You don't have to go in depth or anything, but if you wanted to just give your over or under thoughts, what
I guess we'll run it. Why not?
Yeah, you can do it for Campazzo real quick.
Negative, and we'll leave it at that.
What do you give Kemba?
I'd give him over. I think he did what he was supposed to do.
Yeah, and in terms of like if we're just looking at on-court production, I'd give over for Kemba because he honestly even played better than I thought.
Yeah, he played way better.
It's just he couldn't stay on the floor.
Yeah.
We could grade AJ Lawson, but he just really hasn't had
all 30 seconds of his time on the court.
Yes. Oh, Tyler Dorsey. What did he? I think that he's actually like a definite under for my opinion, at least, because
the
Mavericks brass hyped him up as if he would actually, like, yes, he's on this two-way, but he might see the floor, and I think that was like severely overblown. Like, he played great in the G League, but they just never gave him a crack at the rotation.
No, and especially the fact that we took him over prime AJ Lawson. I just think it only alludes to the case of him being an under asset.
I would like to see AJ Lawson get minute. I really think he could actually have a role on this team, but I mean that's I guess for another day.
Yeah.
But I mean, I legitimately think, like, amidst their 3-and-D woes, like, why not try him out? This is the perfect time. Like,
yeah,
what other chance is he going to have this season?
Yeah, probably not. I think with this sort of window of Josh Green and Dorian coming back, this is probably the perfect time to do so.
No, exactly. I think this is a pretty easily definite answer on this one as well. What about JaVale McGee? Has he over exceeded or under exceeded your expectations this year, Jaren?
No, I'm going to surprise a lot of people. I'm fine. Definitely. I'll leave it at that. He's a good locker room guy, but I mean, that's about it. He's honestly surprised me with, like, for how little minutes he's played, he's done some pretty good shot blocking. I figured it would take some time, but he's I guess come his own. He's like the Mavs leading shot blocker now, which says a lot, but
maybe like in per game averages, definitely not.
But yeah, I think it's like 1.8 blocks per game or something.
Yeah. But just to confirm, like, you picked the under on him, right?
Yeah, for sure under.
Okay.
I thought it's my bad. I don't know if I said it.
No, you're fine. Yeah, no, I would definitely reciprocate that. He has his moments every now and then where he just has his one-off good game, but he doesn't even see the court much, and yeah, just too many compelling factors there. What about for Frank Ntilikina? Do you feel like he's over or under exceed your expectations?
Okay. I'll put him at the middle tier just because coming into the season he was asked to do so many things and he didn't do it. And he did have that weird injury, but we've definitely seen him and he's taken a toll off the defense, like in a good way. He's come in, he's pretty much done what's asked of him. So I'd put him as a positive asset there, but just compared to, what we thought, not even what we thought, but what the coaching staff told us would happen, it has to automatically, like, offset the positive. So I'd put him at a middle ground.
Yeah, I'd put him in the middle ground because if we're talking about my expectations for him, they really didn't change. Despite what the coaching staff and Mavs brass tried to insinuate he could sort of snap into. But if we're talking just like strictly like that, like, he's been kind of the exact same player as last year, steady defender.
Yeah.
Occasionally we'll knock in a three or every once in a blue moon gets to the rim, but it's really all he is. So I would definitely reciprocate what you said there. Theo Pinson, Jaren, has he over or under exceeded your expectations?
Honestly, under. I mean, at times the guy doesn't even look like a basketball player, but I mean,
I guess he didn't play enough, like, in that last little stretch last year. And he actually did decent in those games that he had to come in on that COVID hardship deal. So I was like, I don't know. I guess I had like some sort of skewed perception of him that, like, yes, like, I knew he was one of the worser guys on the roster, obviously, but I thought, like, yes, like, I know he's a culture guy and things of that nature, but I did think that he, like, could still contribute if need be. And, I know he's only got a handful of, like, meaningful minutes and mostly garbage time minutes, but he's definitely hasn't impressed as much. I mean, if I had to pick, like, I don't think I had great expectations for him, but I feel like he's gone slightly under what I maybe even thought he was going to form into. Not even a guy that would get consistent minutes, but just a guy who, if need be, we can plug and play occasionally.
Yeah.
Has Dwight Powell, Jaren, has he over or under exceeded your expectations this year?
I'm gonna, I'll stick with the over. Just because coming into the season we didn't expect him to have a role at all, and he even accepted it, I think. And and pretty much what was asked of him was like, they like, we're looking to you again, and he did that. Now, I mean, granted, he hasn't played great, but I just think, what was given to him, I think he's played honestly pretty good. So
Yeah, no, just from that standpoint that we didn't think he was gonna really see much time in the rotation at the beginning of the year. I feel like we have to put him in over at that standpoint because he hasn't done anything insanely negative regarding
yeah,
that. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know how much else we can really pull from that. Christian Wood, Jaren, is he over or under exceeded your expectations as a Maverick so far?
I didn't realize we have this many people left, but for
Oh
sure
wow.
positive. He's a for sure over. Just the things that he's able to do with on the court with Luka, the way he's able to score. He's honestly emerged as one of the better shot blockers on the team. He's kind of fitting on his own on defense. I just think, all of those factors alone elevate him over, especially with the adversity that he had to come over with the, I guess, coming off the bench for so long sort of aspect. Yeah, I mean, I think he's an automatic over for me.
I would definitely concur. Part of me at the beginning, when I posed that question to you was like, oh, is he really like that much of an over? We've seen him do this before to an extent and at his last stop in Houston. But I guess he's never done this on a winning team. And
Yeah.
there were a lot of questions at the beginning of the season, of course, if you'd even start at points. And we had those questions really until about, I don't know, 8 to 10 games ago. So, I mean, I think from that point, it's like objectively an over. There's no really other way to spin it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would tend to agree with you there. Last guy on the list here is going to be McKinley Wright, the fourth. Do you think that he has over or under exceeded expectations for you this season?
Me, personally, I think he's honestly probably over expectations just because, I didn't think he would play at all. And he's somehow found a way to get a pretty decent role a few games ago. He's definitely, regressed in his game.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't even know if I'd say that, but he's fell out of the rotation a little bit, but
Yeah.
he's still like
Yeah,
on the
okay.
outskirts of it. Like he may play in certain games. Like the fact that he has a role on this team at all is, I think, more than I would have imagined
Yeah.
going into this. Like I was hopeful he would have a role, but I guess I didn't expect it. So good for him, and it's kudos to him that he was actually able to propel himself in this position because I didn't. Admittedly, I wanted him to get here to where he actually saw some time with the main roster because I'd seen the highlights and things and how he was tearing it up with the legends at the beginning of the season and stuff. I just didn't know if it was going to happen, and lo and behold, he's been able to furbish himself an actual role in the NBA to at least a mild extent. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of covers it. Do you have any other thoughts before we end the podcast, Sharon?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, this team has some work to do, but I don't want to say they've over exceeded. I don't want to say they've under exceeded. So it's been a weird season.
It has been a weird season, and I'm still very skeptical as to the identity of this team and
Yeah.
what really is going to happen going forward. But after doing this podcast, I'll say as much that I don't feel better about the team, but I don't feel worse. I
Yeah.
feel like very just like let's roll with the punches and kind of see what happens. But I think that this podcast definitely opened my eyes up after not really looking big picture for a while. That this isn't a lost year, but the Mavericks are not going to win a championship this year in all likelihood.
Yeah.
And they're also probably not going to tank. So from that perspective, just enjoy the moments and let's see how much we can marginally improve this year.
Yeah. I think that's
a very fair sort of prerogative to go into the new year with and to go with into the second half of the season as we approach that territory.
I agree.
But nonetheless, I think it's been a pretty nice pod to kind of look back and look bigger picture at some things. Definitely kind of revelating after not really being able to do this, missed some of our post game podcasts recently. I definitely feel like my mindset has been renewed a little bit regarding the team. So that's always good. We got a little bit more excited after, some of these losses time after time make you kind of feel dead in the water. Just doing the, covering it game after game, but it's good to take a step back and look at this. That's why we want to do this podcast. We appreciate you guys for listening. If you made it this far in the podcast, make sure to like and subscribe to us and comment down below. If you're listening on YouTube, we are Mainstream Mavs Podcast on YouTube. If you are listening on another listening platform, whether that be Apple Podcast or Spotify or whatever other listening platform you're on, we're on almost all listening platforms. For those of you guys just merely listening to the audio, make sure to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us. Mainstream Mavs Podcast, of course. If you enjoyed our content and you enjoyed what we put out, of course, and if you made it this far, we really appreciate you guys. And lastly, make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. We're posting, all our podcasts there, all our thoughts on the Mavericks. We got everything for you guys over there.
Everyday thoughts.
Yes, all the fake trades, all the selling out for John Collins trades.
Yeah.
For those of you guys listening from earlier, that's a shout out to all you guys that wanted to tap into your criticizing bags for me there. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and end the podcast. We will catch you guys Thursday night after the Mavericks play the Lakers as they continue to churn along the choo-choo train on their West Coast road trip. And
Yay!
Let's go. It is 4:30 a.m. Me and Jaren grinded these out for you guys.
Yeah.
So if you listen this far, we really do appreciate you guys. DM us on Twitter if you listen this far. DM us on Twitter, @mainstream_Mavs. Say, I've listened to your podcast this far. I know that you guys don't have anybody listening, but I appreciate you. It would mean a lot to us.
Excellent. It would keep us going.
Yes, it would keep us going as I'm about to pass out as I have work at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and I'm finishing editing this podcast less likely at 5:30. I do this for all the MFFLs out there and for Daddy Doncic. That's all I have.
I think we leave it there.
I've emptied the tank.
Way too much.
My thoughts. I can't think anymore. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace
Bye
out.
bye.